The summer of 1833 brought relentless heat to Davidson County, Tennessee, the kind of heat that made the cotton fields shimmer like an ocean of white under the merciless sun. For the enslaved people working those fields at Briar Hollow Plantation, the air felt like breathing through wet cotton, thick and suffocating. Margaret Thornwood stood on her wide veranda, parasol in hand, watching the distant figures bent over in her fields. At 32, she was the mistress of one of the most prosperous cotton plantations in the county. Her husband, Colonel James Thornwood, had died 3 years prior, leaving her with their 7-year-old son, William, and a plantation that required constant attention. "Seems like they're moving slower than molasses today," she remarked to no one in particular, her voice carrying the soft lilt of old Virginia money. Behind her stood Esther, a woman in her 40s who had been enslaved by the Thornwood family since she was a child. Her face remained carefully blank as she listened to her mistress complain. "Yes, ma'am," Esther replied quietly. "It's mighty hot today." Margaret turned, annoyed at what she perceived as an excuse. "Heat is no reason for laziness. My cotton won't wait for cooler days." What Margaret didn't say, what she never acknowledged, was that Briar Hollow was slowly drowning in debt. Her husband had been a gambling man, making poor investments and taking loans that came due with alarming regularity. The neighboring plantations were expanding, while Briar Hollow struggled to maintain appearances. That evening, as shadows stretched long across the manicured lawn, a carriage arrived at Briar Hollow. The driver, a thin man with a severe expression, helped his passenger down. Augustus Blackwood was a businessman from Nashville, known for his ruthless approach to commerce. Some whispered that he dealt in more than just cotton and tobacco. Margaret greeted him in the parlor, dressed in her finest blue silk, her blonde hair arranged in fashionable curls. "Mr. Blackwood, how kind of you to accept my invitation," she said, offering her hand. Blackwood bowed slightly. "Mrs. Thornwood, the pleasure is mine. Your message suggested urgency." In the kitchen, Esther prepared the evening meal, while her daughter Clara arranged silver on the dining table. At 17, Clara had inherited her mother's high cheekbones and intelligent eyes. She moved with practiced precision, setting each fork and knife exactly as she'd been taught. "What's he doing here?" Clara whispered when she returned to the kitchen. Esther shook her head. "Nothing good comes when that man visits. Just stay out of sight tonight." Unknown to them, Margaret and Blackwood sat in the study, discussing finances over brandy. "Your husband left you in quite a predicament," Blackwood said, examining the ledgers Margaret had reluctantly shared. "These debts to the bank in Nashville will come due by harvest." Margaret's fingers tightened around her glass. "I'm aware, but the crop this year will be exceptional. I've pushed the overseer to ensure it." Blackwood's laugh held no warmth. "You'd need 3 exceptional harvests to clear this debt. No, Mrs. Thornwood, you require a more immediate solution." "What do you suggest?" she asked, desperation edging into her voice. "I've recently expanded my business interests. There's a growing demand for certain commodities in New Orleans and beyond." Margaret frowned. "I'm not selling my land." "Not land, no," Blackwood said carefully, "but you have other assets that would fetch a premium price in the right markets." Understanding dawned on Margaret's face. Selling enslaved people wasn't uncommon, but it was typically done out of necessity or when individuals were deemed troublesome. The implication that she should sell multiple people as a business venture made her hesitate. "I need every hand for the harvest," she said. Blackwood nodded. "Of course, but afterward perhaps we could discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement. I have connections that pay well above market rates for young, healthy individuals." Later that night, as moonlight streamed through the windows of the cabin she shared with 5 others, Esther couldn't sleep. Something about Blackwood's visit had unsettled her. She'd served enough meals to the masters to know when trouble was brewing. In the main house, William Thornwood woke to the sound of voices. At 10 years old, he had his mother's fair hair and his father's serious expression. Curious, he crept from his bedroom toward his mother's study, careful to avoid the creaking floorboards. 30% above standard rates, Blackwood was saying. With your selection, we could clear at least half your debt before winter. The harvest first, his mother replied. I'll consider your proposal afterward. William didn't understand what they were discussing, but he knew it was something his mother didn't want others to know. He'd seen how she presented a perfect facade to their neighbors while privately fretting over the plantation's finances. As summer dragged on, tension grew at Briar Hollow. The overseer, a man named Harris, drove the enslaved workers harder than ever. 2 collapsed from heat exhaustion in August, and 1 elderly man died in the fields. Margaret ordered him buried quickly and increased the water rations, not out of compassion, but necessity. She couldn't afford to lose more workers before harvest. Clara noticed the change in atmosphere. Something's coming, she told her mother as they scrubbed laundry one hot afternoon. I can feel it. Esther wrung out a sheet with more force than necessary. Keep your head down and your ears open. That's all we can do. September brought the cotton harvest, and every hand at Briar Hollow worked from dawn until well after dusk. Fingers bled from the sharp cotton bowls. Backs ached from bending, and still Harris demanded more. The weight of Margaret's financial predicament pressed down on everyone, though few understood the true extent of the danger. In the 3rd week of harvest, William found Clara alone in the library, dusting his father's old books. Unlike many plantation owners, Colonel Thornwood had insisted on maintaining an extensive library, and William had inherited his love of reading. "Hello, Clara," he said quietly. Clara immediately dropped into a curtsy. "Master William, I didn't hear you come in. Do you like books?" he asked, noticing how her eyes had lingered on the volume she was dusting. Clara hesitated. Teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in Tennessee, as in most southern states. "They seem nice, sir." William approached and took the book from her hands. "This one's about ancient Rome. Father read it to me before he died." A shadow crossed his young face. "Mother doesn't read to me anymore. She's always busy with the plantation." Something in his loneliness touched Clara. "My mama tells me stories sometimes," she offered cautiously. "What kind of stories?" "Old ones, from Africa," she says, though she's never been there herself. Her grandmother told them to her. William's eyes widened with interest. "Would you—" He stopped, seeming to remember who they were to each other. "Never mind." As he turned to leave, Clara spoke without thinking. "I could tell you one, if you wanted." The harvest ended in early October, and Briar Hollow's cotton yield was good, though not the miracle Margaret had hoped for. Blackwood's carriage returned the day after the last bale was processed. This time he brought an associate, a tall, thin man named Prentice, who carried a doctor's bag and had cold, evaluating eyes. Margaret met them in her study, away from the curious ears of her house servants. "Mrs. Thornwood," Blackwood said, "allow me to introduce Dr. Prentice. He assists me in assessing merchandise." Margaret nodded stiffly. She'd made her decision during sleepless nights, calculating and recalculating her finances. There was no other way to save Briar Hollow. "I've considered your proposal." "Excellent," Blackwood smiled. "Perhaps we could review your inventory." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she handed over the plantation ledger, which included detailed records of every enslaved person at Briar Hollow, their ages, skills, and health status. Some had been born on the plantation, others had been purchased by her husband or his father before him. "Doctor." Prentice reviewed the list dispassionately. "I'll need to examine the prime candidates personally, particularly any between 12 and 25. The examination took place in the barn the following day. 20 enslaved individuals were lined up while Prentice checked their teeth, muscles, and overall condition, making notes in a small book. Among them was Clara, who stood rigid with fear as the doctor's hands moved over her like she was livestock. Esther watched from the kitchen window, her heart pounding. When Clara had been taken to the barn with the others, she'd known what was happening. Sale, separation, the thing every enslaved person dreaded above all else. That night, as a cold rain began to fall, Esther slipped from her cabin and made her way to the kitchen garden. Clara joined her moments later. "They're selling people," Clara whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Yes," Esther confirmed. "That doctor was marking who's to go." "Did you see his list? Am I—" Esther gripped her daughter's hands. "I don't know, but listen to me. If they sell you, you remember everything I taught you. You keep your head down, you survive, and you look for chances." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to leave you, and I don't want to lose you, but we don't get choices in this life." Esther pulled Clara into a fierce embrace. "Whatever happens, you are not what they say you are. You remember that. You are not property. You are a person, my daughter. Nothing they do can change that." As mother and daughter clung to each other in the dark, rain soaking through their clothes, William watched from his bedroom window. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew it was connected to his mother's meetings with Blackwood. And somehow he sensed it involved Clara, the girl who had secretly begun telling him African folk tales when no one was listening. The next morning, Margaret called William to her study. "Darling," she said, her voice unusually gentle, "Mr. Blackwood will be coming tomorrow to finalize some business arrangements. I need you to stay in your room and focus on your studies." "What kind of business?" William asked. Margaret's smile tightened. "Adult business, nothing for you to worry about." But William had heard the whispers among the house servants. He knew something terrible was about to happen at Briar Hollow, and he was afraid it would change everything. As night fell over the plantation, a sense of dread settled like a shroud. In the quarters, families held each other close, not knowing which of them would be torn apart when morning came. In the main house, Margaret Thornwood drank brandy alone in her study, telling herself she had no choice, that sacrificing some was necessary to preserve the whole. And in the shadows between cabins, Esther whispered urgent plans to trusted friends. If Clara was to be sold, she would not go quietly into that good night. The bonds of family ran deeper than any chain, and at Briar Hollow, a desperate mother was prepared to risk everything for the daughter she loved. Dawn broke with a heavy mist, clinging to the fields of Briar Hollow. The air was cool, carrying the first hints of autumn as the plantation stirred to life. In the main house, Margaret Thornwood dressed with particular care, selecting a deep green dress that emphasized her still youthful figure. Today was business, and appearances mattered. In the kitchen, Esther worked methodically, her movements mechanical as she prepared breakfast for the household. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with plans and prayers. Beside her, Clara moved like a ghost, her usual vibrancy dimmed by fear. "Stand up straight," Esther murmured. "Whatever happens today, don't let them see you broken." Clara nodded, squaring her shoulders. At 17, she'd grown into a beautiful young woman with a quiet dignity that even the harshness of enslavement hadn't erased. Outside, the sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced Blackwood's arrival. Margaret met him on the porch, extending her hand with practiced grace. "Mr. Blackwood, right on time." He bowed slightly. "Mrs. Thornwood, I trust you've made your selections." "Let's discuss inside," she replied, leading him to the study where a breakfast tray awaited. As they settled with coffee and biscuits, Blackwood withdrew papers from his leather portfolio. "Dr. Prentice was quite impressed with several of your people. Based on his assessment, I can offer premium prices for 8 individuals." Margaret's face remained carefully composed. "I've reviewed the plantation's needs. I can part with 6 at most." Blackwood raised an eyebrow. 6? That won't address even half your debt." "It will be enough to satisfy the bank for now," Margaret countered. "I can't sacrifice productivity completely." The negotiation continued through the morning, voices occasionally rising as figures were proposed and rejected. In the hallway, William pressed his ear to the study door, straining to hear. At 10, he understood more than his mother realized about the plantation's operations. "The field hands you've selected, plus the blacksmith's youngest boy," his mother was saying. "And the girl," Blackwood added. Clara, I believe. Dr. Prentice was particularly impressed with her. Healthy, intelligent, and quite beautiful. She'll fetch a premium in New Orleans. William's stomach clenched. Clara. The girl who had been secretly telling him stories when his mother wasn't watching, who smiled at him kindly when she thought no one could see. They were going to sell her. Without thinking, he burst into the study. "Mother, you can't!" Margaret stood abruptly, shock and anger crossing her face. "William, what are you doing? Go to your room immediately." "You can't sell Clara," the boy insisted, his voice shaking. "She belongs here." Blackwood watched the exchange with cold interest. "Your son seems quite attached to your house girl, Mrs. Thornwood." Margaret's cheeks flushed. "William, this is adult business that doesn't concern you. Go to your room now, or there will be consequences." Reluctantly, William backed out of the room, his eyes filling with tears of frustration. As the door closed, he heard Blackwood say, "Children can be so sentimental about these matters. My own daughter cried for weeks when we sold her nursemaid." In the kitchen, Esther worked with mounting anxiety. She'd sent Clara to the spring house, hoping to keep her out of sight while the negotiations continued. Through the window, she could see several men arriving at the stables, Blackwood's associates, ready to transport human cargo once the deals were finalized. By mid-afternoon, Margaret summoned Harris, the overseer. "Bring these individuals to the north field," she instructed, handing him a list. "Mr. Blackwood's men will handle the rest." Harris nodded. "Yes, ma'am. What about their belongings?" "They can take what they can carry in a single bundle," Margaret replied dismissively. Nothing more. As Harris left to carry out her orders, Margaret poured herself a small glass of brandy, needing its fortification. The sale would clear enough debt to keep the bank at bay until next harvest. It was necessary, she told herself. She had no choice. Word spread through the quarters like wildfire. Names were whispered, and quiet sobs could be heard from several cabins as people hastily gathered meager possessions. Among the names on the list was Clara's. When Esther heard, she dropped the pot she was scrubbing, sending soapy water across the kitchen floor. "No," she whispered. "Dear God, no." In the spring house, Clara was organizing preserved fruits when Harris found her. "Come on, girl," he said gruffly. "You're wanted in the north field." Clara's hands began to tremble. "Why, sir?" Harris avoided her eyes. "Just come along now. No trouble." As Clara was led across the plantation, she saw others being gathered, 5 field workers, most younger men, and the blacksmith's 12-year-old son. Their faces wore identical expressions of suppressed terror. They all knew what this meant. At the main house, William watched from his bedroom window, tears streaming down his face. He'd been sent upstairs without lunch, as punishment for his interruption. Now he could only watch helplessly as people he'd known his entire life were led away like cattle to market. "I hate this," he whispered to himself. "I hate all of this." In the kitchen, Esther moved with desperate purpose. She'd spent years building a small collection of items hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her sleeping pallet. A crude map drawn on a scrap of cloth, directions whispered by an itinerant preacher, a small knife, and 37 cents saved over more than a decade. Now she stuffed these treasures into a small cloth pouch. Margaret Thornwood stood beside Blackwood in the north field as the selected enslaved people were lined up for final inspection. Dr. Prentice moved down the line, making last-minute checks of teeth and muscles. When he reached Clara, he nodded approvingly. "Excellent specimen," he murmured. "She'll do very well in New Orleans." Clara kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She'd been taught from birth to hide her emotions, to present a blank face to the masters. But inside, her heart was breaking at the thought of leaving her mother, the only constant in her uncertain life. Blackwood turned to Margaret. "Everything appears to be in order. Shall we complete the paperwork?" As they returned to the house, leaving the enslaved people under guard, Esther approached Harris. "Please, sir," she said, her voice carefully modulated to hide her desperation. "Might I say goodbye to my daughter?" Harris hesitated. He wasn't a cruel man by nature, just a practical one who followed orders. "Be quick about it," he said finally. 5 minutes, no more." Esther hurried to the north field, her heart pounding. When she reached Clara, she pulled her into a tight embrace. "Listen to me," she whispered urgently. "Take this." She pressed the small cloth pouch into Clara's hands. "Hide it well. The map shows routes north. The knife is for protection, not violence, unless there's no choice. The money won't get you far, but it's something." Clara clutched the pouch, tears finally breaking free. "Mama, I can't." "You can, and you will," Esther said fiercely. "You're stronger than you know. Remember the stories I told you? About those who escaped? About the people who help? Look for the signs, a candle in a window, a quilt with a certain pattern. Trust carefully. Move by night." "Oh, what about you?" Clara asked, her voice breaking. Esther shook her head. "My time for running is past, but you have a chance." One of Blackwood's men approached. "Time's up." Esther gripped Clara's shoulders. "Remember who you are. Remember I love you." And Clara, her voice dropped to the barest whisper, "Find the underground. Ask for Moses." Adieu. With that cryptic message, Esther was forced to step away. Clara tucked the precious pouch into her dress, hiding it against her skin. As her mother walked back toward the main house, Clara committed every detail of her to memory. The proud set of her shoulders, despite years of servitude, the grey beginning to streak her dark hair, the hands strong from endless work. Inside the house, Margaret and Blackwood sat at the dining table, finalizing the transaction. Bills of sale were signed, ownership transferred with the stroke of a pen. Blackwood counted out banknotes and gold coins, which Margaret accepted with steady hands. "A pleasure doing business with you, Mrs. Thornwood," Blackwood said, gathering his papers. "My men will depart within the hour. We have a schedule to maintain." Margaret nodded. "Of course. Would you care for refreshment before you leave?" "No, thank you. I prefer to conclude these matters efficiently." As Blackwood left to oversee the final preparations, Margaret remained seated, staring at the money on the table. It represented survival for Briar Hollow, for herself and William. The price had been high, but necessary. Outside, chains were being fastened around wrists and ankles. The 6 enslaved people would travel south by wagon until they reached the Tennessee River, then by boat to New Orleans. Clara stood silent as cold metal closed around her wrists, the reality of her situation crashing over her in waves. In the kitchen, Esther worked mechanically, her mind far away with her daughter. She didn't notice William slip in through the back door until he spoke. "They're taking Clara away," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. Esther turned, remembering herself just in time to curtsy. "Yes, Master William." "It's wrong," the boy said fiercely. "Father wouldn't have done this." Esther remained silent. Colonel Thornwood had sold people too, though perhaps not as callously as his widow. William approached her, his young face troubled. "Clara was teaching me her stories, African stories. She said they were important to remember." "They are, Master William," Esther replied carefully. "They're all we have left of home." "I want to help her," William said suddenly. "Tell me how to help." Esther looked at the boy, the master's son, heir to Briar Hollow and all its sins. For a moment she saw not his position, but his humanity, his innate sense of justice not yet corrupted by the world he'd been born into. "Pray for her, Master William," she said finally. "That's all any of us can do now." But William shook his head. "No, there has to be more." Outside, the wagon was prepared. One by one, the enslaved people climbed aboard, settling on rough wooden benches. Clara was the last to board, her eyes scanning the plantation one final time, seeking a glimpse of her mother. Instead, she saw William running across the yard, something clutched in his hand. He dodged Harris and approached the wagon. "Clara," he called, "take this." Before anyone could stop him, he thrust a small object through the slats of the wagon. Clara caught it reflexively, a small leather-bound book, worn with age. "Stories," William gasped. "So you don't forget." One of Blackwood's men cuffed William lightly. "Get back to the house, boy. This isn't your concern." Clara quickly hid the book in her dress alongside her mother's pouch. As William was led away, their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding, two souls recognizing a common humanity despite the vast gulf society had placed between them. The wagon lurched forward, wheels grinding against gravel. Clara gripped the rough wooden bench, her face turned toward Briar Hollow for as long as it remained in sight. She memorized every detail. The white-columned house, the sprawling cotton fields, the row of cabins where she'd spent her entire life, and standing at the edge of the kitchen garden, a solitary figure, Esther, watching until the wagon disappeared from view, her face wet with silent tears. In her study, Margaret sorted the money she'd received, organizing it meticulously for deposit at the Nashville bank. The coins clinked softly as she counted, each sound the echo of a human life traded. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across her face. Then she hardened her resolve. This was the way of the world. This was business. As night fell over Briar Hollow, the plantation seemed unnaturally quiet. 6 fewer voices in the quarters, 6 fewer souls under Margaret Thornwood's dominion. In the kitchen, Esther worked silently, her movements slow and heavy with grief. In his bedroom, William clutched his pillow, tears soaking into the fine cotton pillowcase as he struggled to understand the cruelty of the world he was born into. And miles away, heading south toward an uncertain fate, Clara sat in the swaying wagon, one hand pressed against her dress where the hidden treasures lay, her mother's desperate gifts of hope and a child's offering of memory. In the darkness, surrounded by others facing the same terrible journey, she closed her eyes and began to silently recite the stories she'd been taught. Stories of survival, stories of strength, stories of freedom. This was not the end, she told herself. This was just another chapter in a longer tale, and she was determined to be the one who would tell it. The wagon carrying Clara and the other enslaved people from Briar Hollow lurched over rutted roads for 3 days. They traveled south through Tennessee, the landscape gradually changing from the rolling hills of Davidson County to the flatter terrain approaching the Mississippi state line. Each jolt sent pain through Clara's shackled wrists and ankles, the metal cutting into her skin despite the strips of cloth she'd torn from her dress to create makeshift padding. Nights were spent in crude holding pens at waypoints along the slave trade route, facilities designed specifically for the temporary housing of human cargo. The 6 from Briar Hollow huddled together for warmth and comfort, bound by their shared fate if not by friendship. Jacob, the blacksmith's 12-year-old son, cried silently each night. Clara would whisper stories to him, legends her mother had taught her, tales of strength and resilience that had been passed down through generations. "My mama says our stories are like seeds," she told him quietly on the second night, their voices low to avoid attracting the attention of their guards. "They look dead and dry, but plant them in your heart, and they grow into something that can't be killed." By the 4th day, they reached the Tennessee River. There, they were transferred to a flatboat that would carry them downriver to the Mississippi and eventually to New Orleans. More enslaved people were already aboard. 23 souls from various plantations across Tennessee and Kentucky, all bound for the notorious slave markets of the Deep South. Conditions on the flatboat were worse than the wagon. They were kept below deck in a cramped space that reeked of fear, waste, and despair. The only light came from cracks between the wooden planks above, casting thin slivers of brightness across faces etched with sorrow. Clara tucked herself into a corner, careful to keep her precious possessions hidden. During a quiet moment, she examined the book William had given her, a collection of folk tales from around the world, its pages yellowed with age. Inside the front cover, Colonel Thornwood had written, "To my son William, may these stories inspire your imagination and cultivate your humanity. Your loving father, Christmas, 1830." The irony wasn't lost on Clara. A book intended to cultivate humanity had found its way into the hands of someone whose humanity was denied by the very system that had produced both the book and her current circumstances. At night, when the guards were less attentive, Clara would carefully study the crude map her mother had given her. It showed rivers, mountains, and a series of markings that meant nothing to most eyes, but represented safe houses along the Underground Railroad to those who knew how to read them. Clara committed it to memory, then ate the scrap of cloth to destroy any evidence. "What are you going to do in New Orleans?" whispered a woman named Patience, who had been sold from a plantation near Memphis. Clara hesitated before responding. "Whatever I have to, but I won't be there forever." Patience's eyes widened slightly at the implication. "That's dangerous talk." "Living is dangerous," Clara replied. "At least this way, the danger has purpose." 10 days after leaving Briar Hollow, the flatboat reached New Orleans. The air was different here, heavy with humidity and strange scents, the salt of the nearby ocean mixing with exotic spices and the unmistakable odor of the city's less savory corners. The enslaved people were marched from the docks to a compound surrounded by high walls in the heart of the city's slave trading district. Inside, they were separated by gender for preparation, a dehumanizing process of being washed, dressed in clean but coarse clothing, and inspected once more for any health issues that might have developed during transport. Clara managed to keep her book and knife by hiding them in a loose section of floorboard beneath her sleeping mat, retrieving them after the inspections were complete. The following morning, Blackwood himself arrived at the compound. He walked through the women's quarters, examining merchandise with a practiced eye. When he reached Clara, he stopped. "You'll do very well here," he said, his tone businesslike. "I have a particular buyer in mind for you." Clara kept her eyes downcast. "Yes, sir. You're fortunate," he continued. "Some plantation owners treat their property as mere tools, but Mr. Devereaux appreciates beauty and refinement in his household staff. If you're obedient and quick to learn, your life could be relatively comfortable." The implication was clear, and Clara felt bile rise in her throat. She'd heard whispers about the fate of young enslaved women sold to certain New Orleans households. Beautiful house servants often served their masters in ways that had nothing to do with cooking or cleaning. That afternoon, Clara and several other women were taken to a small auction house that catered to wealthy clients seeking domestic servants. Unlike the main slave markets with their public spectacles, this establishment offered a more discreet experience for buyers who preferred to select their purchases in relative privacy. Clara stood on a small platform as Blackwood described her qualities to a group of prospective buyers. She forced herself to retreat deep inside her mind, reciting her mother's stories silently as strangers examined her teeth, hands, and figure with clinical detachment. "This young woman is 17, healthy and intelligent," Blackwood was saying. "She can read basic instructions, though not books, of course, and has been trained in household duties. She comes from a respectable Tennessee plantation where she served as a house girl." A tall man with silver-streaked dark hair and expensive clothing stepped forward. "Let me see her hands." Clara extended her hands, palms up. They were smoother than those of field workers, but still showed the calluses of someone who had worked hard her entire life. The man nodded approvingly. "And her temperament?" "Obedient and quick to learn," Blackwood replied. "No history of rebelliousness or escape attempts." Clara kept her expression neutral, though inside she burned with rage at being discussed like livestock. The man, who she assumed must be Devereaux, circled her slowly, assessing. "I'll take her," he said finally. "Have the paperwork prepared." Just like that, Clara's ownership changed hands once more. Money was exchanged, documents signed, and by sundown she found herself being led through the ornate iron gates of a French Quarter mansion. The Devereaux residence was a 3-story building with a central courtyard. elaborate balconies, and a facade that spoke of old money and established position. As she was led through the back entrance, Clara took careful note of doors, windows, and the layout of the property. Knowledge was power, and she intended to gather as much of it as possible. A stern-faced woman in her 50s met them at the service entrance. "I'm Mrs. Reynolds, the housekeeper," she informed Clara. "You'll report directly to me." Clara curtsied. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Devereux runs an orderly household. There are 12 other servants. You'll be expected to learn your place quickly." Clara was shown to a small room in the attic that she would share with another enslaved woman named Lucy, who had been with the Devereux family for 5 years. The room was sparse but clean, with 2 narrow beds, a washstand, and a small window that overlooked the courtyard. "You're lucky," Lucy told her that evening as they prepared for bed. "Some masters in New Orleans treat their people worse than animals. Mr. Devereux, at least, provides decent food and quarters." "Is he kind?" Clara asked carefully. Lucy's expression grew guarded. "He doesn't use the whip often, but he has other expectations, especially for the younger women in the household." Clara's stomach tightened. "I see. Don't fight it," Lucy advised in a whisper. "Those who resist end up sold to the plantations. And believe me, you don't want to cut sugarcane in the Louisiana sun." That night, Clara lay awake long after Lucy had fallen asleep. She reached beneath her thin mattress where she'd hidden her treasures, the book, the knife, and the few coins. These small objects represented her only connection to her past and her only hope for the future. "I won't be here forever," she whispered to herself, so quietly that even the sleeping Lucy couldn't hear. "This is not my destiny." Days at the Devereux mansion fell into a routine. Clara rose before dawn to help prepare breakfast for the household. Throughout the day, she cleaned, polished silver, helped with laundry, and assisted the cook with meal preparations. Mrs. Reynolds watched her closely, correcting any mistakes with sharp words, and occasionally the switch she carried in her pocket. Mr. Devereux himself was seldom home during daylight hours, involved as he was with his shipping business and social obligations. When he was present, Clara noticed how his eyes followed her movements. So far, he had made no direct approaches, but the weight of his gaze felt like a physical touch, making her skin crawl. "He's biding his time," Lucy explained when Clara mentioned it. "Breaking you into the household first. That's his way." 2 weeks after her arrival, Clara was summoned to Mr. Devereux's study. She entered with downcast eyes, hands clasped before her. "Clara, isn't it?" he said, looking up from his desk. "Yes, master," she replied, using the term she'd been instructed to employ. Devereux rose and walked around his desk. "Mrs. Reynolds speaks well of your work. You learn quickly." "Thank you, master." He circled her slowly. "I have certain standards for my household staff. Cleanliness, obedience, loyalty. I reward those qualities generously. Do you understand?" Clara swallowed hard. "Yes, master." He reached out to touch her cheek. "You're quite beautiful. Has anyone told you that before?" Clara froze, her heart hammering. "No, master." "A shame," he murmured. "Beauty should be appreciated." His fingers traced the line of her jaw. "From now on, you'll attend to my personal quarters. Mrs. Reynolds will explain your new duties." After she was dismissed, Clara hurried to the kitchen, fighting nausea. Mrs. Reynolds was waiting with a list of new responsibilities, maintaining Mr. Devereux's wardrobe, cleaning his private rooms, and serving his evening brandy. "He's taken a shine to you," the housekeeper said, her tone neutral. "That can make your life easier or harder, depending on how you handle it." That night, Clara barely slept. New Orleans was not like Briar Hollow. The city was a maze of streets and alleys, patrolled by men whose job was to catch runaway enslaved people. She had no connections here, no knowledge of who might be sympathetic to her plight. "Find the underground. Ask for Moses," her mother had said. But how could she do that without risking capture or worse? Over the following days, Clara absorbed everything she could about New Orleans. She listened to conversations between other servants, studied the patterns of the household, and observed the city from her attic window. On Sundays, when some enslaved people were permitted a few hours of freedom to attend church services, she accompanied Lucy to a small chapel where both free and enslaved black people worshipped. It was at church that Clara first noticed an elderly woman who sang with particular feeling during the hymns. Something about her, perhaps the quiet dignity of her bearing or the knowing look in her eyes, made Clara pay attention. After the third Sunday, as they were leaving the chapel, Clara deliberately dropped her handkerchief near the woman. As she bent to retrieve it, their eyes met. "Beautiful singing, ma'am," Clara said softly. The woman nodded. "Music sustains the spirit when the body is weary, especially the old songs." "My mother taught me songs," Clara replied, "songs with hidden meanings." The woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Did she now? Sounds like a wise woman. She told me to look for signs, for friends who might know of better places." The woman glanced around casually, ensuring no one was paying attention to their conversation. "The river rises in spring," she said cryptically, "makes travel difficult for some, easier for others." She paused. "The bakery on Rampart Street sometimes needs extra hands on Thursdays." With that, she moved away, leaving Clara with the first tenuous thread of hope she'd felt since arriving in New Orleans. The following Thursday, Clara asked Mrs. Reynolds for permission to visit the market for fresh herbs the cook needed. Such errands were sometimes allowed for trusted servants, though they were expected to return promptly. With permission granted, Clara made her way through the streets, navigating by landmarks she'd memorized from her attic window. The bakery on Rampart Street was a modest establishment with a weathered sign showing a loaf of bread. Clara entered hesitantly, a small coin from her hidden savings clutched in her palm. An older white man with flour-dusted hands greeted her. "What can I help you with?" Clara swallowed nervously. "I heard you might need extra hands on Thursdays." The baker's expression remained neutral, but he studied her more carefully. "Who told you that?" "A woman at the chapel. She sings beautifully." He nodded slightly. "Wait here." He disappeared into the back of the shop, returning moments later with a small loaf of bread. 3 cents, he said loudly, for the benefit of other customers. As Clara handed over her coin, he pressed the bread into her hands, along with something else, a small folded paper tucked beneath the loaf. "Come again next week if you're satisfied with our bread," he said meaningfully. Clara hurried back to the Devereux mansion, hiding the paper inside her shoe. Only late that night, when Lucy was asleep, did she dare to examine it by moonlight from their small window. The note was brief. "Friends meet at midnight, second Sunday, behind the Cooper's shop on Bourbon Street. Bring proof of your intention." Clara's heart raced. This was it, her first real contact with what must be part of the Underground Railroad. The network of secret routes and safe houses that helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North. But what was proof of intention? And how could she slip away at midnight without being caught? The Devereux household was locked tight after dark, with Harris, the burly doorman, keeping watch through the night. As October turned to November, Mr. Devereux's attentions became more overt. He would summon Clara to his study late in the evening, ostensibly to serve him brandy, but his hands would linger when taking the glass. Sometimes he would ask her personal questions about her life at Briar Hollow, whether she'd had any special friends there. Clara answered carefully, maintaining the facade of the obedient servant while inwardly recoiling from each interaction. She knew it was only a matter of time before his attentions progressed to demands she couldn't evade. The second Sunday of November arrived. During the church service, Clara slipped the elderly woman a note, confirming she would be at the meeting. The woman made no acknowledgement beyond a barely perceptible nod. That night, after the household retired, Clara lay fully dressed beneath her blanket, waiting for Lucy's breathing to deepen into sleep. At 11:30, she silently retrieved her hidden treasures, the knife, the coins, and William's book. The book, she decided, would be her proof of intention. D. What could demonstrate her commitment to freedom more than an object that symbolized knowledge, the very thing enslaved people were legally denied. Sneaking out of the Devereux mansion required nerves of steel and precise timing. Clara had spent weeks observing Harris's habits. Every night at midnight, he would make a circuit of the downstairs, checking doors and windows. During that time, his post near the service entrance would be briefly unattended. Clara crept down the servants' staircase, wincing at every creak. She reached the kitchen just as she heard Harris's heavy footsteps moving toward the front parlor. With trembling hands, she unlocked the kitchen door, using a key she had carefully made an impression of in candle wax weeks earlier, then shaped from a bit of metal she'd painstakingly filed from an old hinge. The night air was cool against her face as she slipped into the courtyard. The service gate was locked, but Clara had discovered that one of the decorative iron panels was loose enough to squeeze through if she exhaled completely. Once on the street, she moved quickly through the shadows, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might alert the night watchman who patrolled the wealthy neighborhoods. The cooper's shop was 15 minutes away on foot, 15 minutes during which she could be spotted, questioned, arrested, or worse. By some miracle, she reached the location without incident. Behind the shop, in a small alley lit only by distant moonlight, 3 figures waited. Clara approached cautiously, one hand clutching the book, the other wrapped around the handle of her hidden knife. "You're the girl from the chapel," one figure said, a man's voice, deep but quiet. Clara nodded. "I was told to bring proof of my intention." She held out William's book. The man took it, turning it over in his hands. "You can read." "Yes," Clara admitted. "My mother taught me in secret." This seemed to impress them. The elderly woman from the chapel stepped forward. "What's your name, child?" "Clara." "And why should we risk our lives to help you, Clara?" The question was direct, challenging. Clara took a deep breath. "Because every person deserves freedom. Because I won't live as property. Because my mother gave everything she had to give me this chance, and I won't waste it." The 3 exchanged glances. The third figure, a younger man who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "It's dangerous, more so than usual right now. The patrols have doubled since that business in Virginia." Clara didn't know what business in Virginia he referred to, but she understood the implied warning. "I'm willing to risk it." "You'll need money," the elderly woman said, "more than whatever you've managed to save." Clara's heart sank. "I have only 37 cents. "Not enough for passage north," the first man confirmed. "I can work," Clara offered desperately. "Whatever it takes." The elderly woman studied her face. "There might be a way. We have a contact, a Quaker businessman who helps move people north. But it would mean waiting until spring when his shipments increase." "I don't have until spring," Clara said, thinking of Devereux's increasingly bold advances. She stopped, unable to articulate her fears. Understanding passed between the 3 conspirators. This was not an uncommon situation. "There's one possibility," the younger man said reluctantly. "The German merchant. He leaves for Cincinnati in 2 weeks. "Too risky," the older man argued. "He's not part of our regular network." "But he's sympathetic," the younger countered, "and his wagon has the false bottom." The elderly woman turned to Clara. "Listen carefully, child. This is not the safest route, but if you're determined to leave now, it may be your only chance. There's a German merchant named Müller who trades between New Orleans and Cincinnati. He's helped people before, but he's not part of our organized network. If you can reach the North Wharf by dawn, 2 Mondays from now, he might take you." Clara committed the details to memory. "How will I recognize him?" "Tall man, red beard. His wagon has a blue tarpaulin with a painted yellow star. You'll need to approach carefully. Ask if he has any books for sale about birds." 2 weeks. Clara would have to survive 2 more weeks in the Devereux household, maintain her cover, and somehow slip away permanently without raising alarms that would bring the slave catchers down on her before she could reach the wharf. As she crept back to the mansion that night, Clara's mind raced with both hope and fear. Freedom was a possibility now, not just a distant dream. But the path to it was fraught with danger, and one misstep could lead not just to failure, but to a fate far worse than her current situation. Back in her attic room, Clara silently replaced the loose floorboard over her remaining treasures. Lucy stirred but didn't wake. Dawn was only a few hours away, and with it would come another day of servitude, of carefully maintaining appearances while secretly preparing for the most important journey of her life. As she finally drifted into anxious sleep, Clara thought of her mother at Briar Hollow, wondering if she would ever see her again. "I'll find a way back to you," she promised silently. "Somehow, someday." This is not the end of our story. But first, she had to write the next chapter herself, a dangerous tale of escape through a hostile world that saw her not as a human being with dreams and rights, but as property to be bought, sold, and used, according to the whims of those who claimed to own her. 2 weeks. 2 weeks to plan her bid for freedom. 2 weeks that would determine whether she lived as a person or died as someone's possession. The 2 weeks following Clara's clandestine meeting passed with excruciating slowness. Each day at the Devereux mansion required perfect performance. The obedient servant, eyes downcast, voice soft, movements efficient. Any deviation might arouse suspicion, and suspicion could destroy everything. Mr. Devereux's attentions continued to escalate. He began summoning Clara to his private quarters in the evenings, ostensibly to turn down his bed or bring him tea. His hands would brush against hers deliberately, his eyes following her movements with predatory interest. Each encounter left Clara feeling soiled, though he had not yet made the final demand she dreaded. "He's hosting a dinner party this Saturday," Mrs. Reynolds informed the household staff one morning. "Important business associates, everything must be perfect." The news sent a chill through Clara. The dinner party would be just 2 days before her planned escape. It would mean extra work, later hours, and more scrutiny, all complications she didn't need. In her rare moments alone, Clara made careful preparations. She sewed a hidden pocket into her petticoat for the money and the knife. She memorized the route to the North Wharf, studying it from her attic window and during brief errands. Most importantly, she observed the household routine, identifying exactly when and how she would make her final exit. The Saturday of the dinner party arrived with a flurry of activity. Florists delivered elaborate arrangements, caterers brought additional food to supplement what the household cook prepared, and extra servants were hired for the evening. The chaos worked in Clara's favor. With so many unfamiliar faces moving through the house, her own comings and goings attracted less attention. As she helped arrange flowers in the dining room, Clara overheard a conversation between Mr. Devereux and his business partner, a heavy-set man named Pritchard. "Troubled times, Devereux," Pritchard was saying. "This business in Virginia has everyone on edge. They're saying 30 whites killed, farms burned to the ground." "Exaggerated reports," Devereux replied dismissively. "But I've doubled the night watches nonetheless. Can't be too careful with the current climate." Clara kept her expression neutral as she worked, but her mind raced. This must be the business in Virginia that the Underground Railroad contacts had mentioned, some kind of uprising, and now security in New Orleans was tightened. Her escape had just become even more dangerous. That evening, as the dinner party progressed, Clara moved efficiently between kitchen and dining room, serving courses and clearing plates. The conversation flowed freely among the 12 guests, fueled by expensive wine and shared business interests. "My associate in Boston writes that the abolitionists grow more vocal by the day," one guest commented. "Dangerous talk spreading through their churches and lecture halls." "Let them talk," another replied. "The economy of the South rests on our peculiar institution. No amount of northern moralizing will change that simple fact." Mr. Devereux nodded sagely. "Gentlemen, the issue is not morality but practicality. Our way of life is built on a foundation they fail to understand." Remove one stone, and the entire structure collapses. Clara served coffee with steady hands, while rage burned inside her. To these men, she and millions like her were not people but stones in a foundation, objects whose sole purpose was to support the comfort and wealth of others. Later, as the party wound down past midnight, Clara was clearing the last glasses from the parlour when she found herself alone with Mr. Devereux. The other servants had moved to the dining room or kitchen, and the guests had departed. "You performed admirably tonight," he said, his words slightly slurred from wine. "Mrs. Reynolds has trained you well." Thank you, master," Clara replied, keeping her eyes on her work. He moved closer, blocking her path to the door. "I've been patient, Clara, given you time to adjust to my household." Clara's heart hammered in her chest. "Yes, master." His hand reached out to touch her cheek. "I think we understand each other now, don't we? What I expect from a girl as special as you." Clara forced herself to remain still, though every instinct screamed for her to run. "Mr. Devereux, Tomorrow night?" he interrupted, his voice low and insistent. "After the household retires, you'll come to my quarters." It wasn't a request. Clara lowered her eyes, mind racing. "Yes, master." He seemed satisfied with her acquiescence, stepping aside to let her pass. As she hurried to the kitchen with the tray of glasses, Clara's resolve hardened. She would not be here tomorrow night. She would not submit to this man's desires. Her escape, planned for Monday dawn, would have to happen sooner. In the early hours of Sunday morning, while the household slept off the excesses of the dinner party, Clara made her final preparations. She dressed in her plainest dress with a dark shawl, filled a small cloth bundle with the few necessities she could carry, and retrieved her money and knife from their hiding place. Lucy stirred as Clara moved about their small attic room. "What are you doing?" she murmured sleepily. Clara froze. She hadn't planned on Lucy waking. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered. "Thought I'd get an early start on the breakfast preparations." Lucy sat up, suddenly more alert. She looked at Clara's bundle, then at her face. Understanding dawned in her eyes. "You're running," she said flatly. "Lucy, Don't," Lucy interrupted. "Don't tell me. If they ask, I can honestly say I don't know anything." Clara hesitated. "Will you raise the alarm?" Lucy held her gaze for a long moment before sighing. "How far do you think you'll get? The patrols are everywhere. They'll catch you before you reach the city limits." "Maybe," Clara acknowledged, "but I have to try." Lucy studied her with a mixture of fear and admiration. "He'll be furious. He'll take it out on all of us when you're gone." The truth of this statement hit Clara like a physical blow. Her escape would have consequences for those left behind. Punishments, increased restrictions, suspicion. It was the cruel reality of their situation. Even the act of claiming one's own freedom came at a cost to others. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, "but I can't stay. Not after tonight, not with what he expects tomorrow." Understanding passed between them. Lucy had been at the Devereux mansion longer. She knew exactly what awaited Clara. "Go then," Lucy said finally. "I'll say you were gone when I woke. It will give you a few more hours." Clara impulsively embraced her, this woman who had been a reluctant mentor and companion in captivity. "Thank you," she breathed. Lucy pulled back. "If you make it, if you reach the north, remember those of us still in chains." "I will," Clara promised. "Always." Slipping out of the mansion proved easier than Clara had anticipated. The household was still in disarray from the previous night's festivities, and the night watchman had dozed off at his post, lulled by the quiet and a flask of whiskey he thought no one knew about. The streets of New Orleans were never truly empty, even in the pre-dawn hours. Clara kept her head down, walking purposefully as if on an errand. She had removed her servant's cap and arranged her shawl to partially obscure her face. To casual observers, she might be a free woman of color going about legitimate business. Her destination was not the North Wharf, not yet. Dawn was still hours away, and she couldn't risk waiting there in the open. Instead, she headed for the small chapel where she had attended Sunday services. Behind the chapel was a shed used for storing hymnals and church supplies. If she could hide there until closer to the meeting time, she might avoid the night patrols that were particularly vigilant in the hours before dawn. The chapel was dark and silent as Clara approached. She slipped around to the back, heart pounding as she tested the shed door. It was locked. Fighting panic, she searched for another option. The chapel itself was likely locked as well, and breaking in would be both a sin and a crime, one that could see her hanged if caught. A noise from the street sent her pressing into the shadows behind a large oak tree. 2 night patrollers walked past, lanterns swinging as they scanned the area. Clara held her breath, praying they wouldn't look too closely at the church grounds. "Heard they caught 2 runaways by the river last night," one patroller commented to his companion. "Boy and a woman, trying to stow away on a steamboat." "Fools," the other replied. "Ever since that business in Virginia, they've been watching the waterfront like hawks." The patrollers moved on, their voices fading into the night. Clara remained frozen in place, their conversation confirming her worst fears. The waterfront, her planned escape route, was under heavy surveillance. A soft sound behind her made Clara whirl around, knife half drawn from its hiding place. "Easy, child," came a familiar voice. The elderly woman from the chapel, from the Underground Railroad meeting, stood in the shadows. "I thought you might come here." Relief flooded through Clara. "They're watching the wharf," she whispered urgently. "The patrollers said—" "I know," the woman interrupted. "Word reached us yesterday. Müller's route is no longer safe. We need another way." The woman gestured for Clara to follow her. They moved silently through the church grounds to a small cottage behind the chapel, the sexton's quarters. The woman knocked in a specific pattern, and the door opened to reveal the younger man from the meeting. "You're early," he said to Clara, surprise and concern in his voice. "The plan was for Monday." "Circumstances changed," Clara replied simply. The man nodded in understanding. "Come in, quickly." Inside the modest cottage, Clara found herself in a simple but clean living room. The elderly woman, who introduced herself only as Martha, offered her a seat and a cup of water. "You've complicated things by coming early," the man said. His name, he told her, was Samuel, and he was a free man of color who worked as the chapel's sexton while secretly helping with the Underground Railroad. "I had no choice," Clara explained, briefly describing Devereaux's ultimatum. Martha's face hardened. "A familiar story. Well, God's timing is not always convenient, but it is always perfect. We'll find another way." For the next hour, they discussed possibilities in hushed tones. The increased patrols made river travel extremely dangerous. Overland routes were monitored at every major road. It seemed that every escape path was blocked. "There's still Reverend Cooper's method," Samuel suggested reluctantly. Martha shook her head. "Too risky. The girl has no papers." "What is Reverend Cooper's method?" Clara asked. The two exchanged glances before Martha sighed. "Reverend Cooper sometimes smuggles people north disguised as servants accompanying white abolitionists traveling on legitimate business. But it requires forged free papers that would pass inspection, and we don't have time to create those for you." "What about Garrison's offer?" Samuel pressed. Martha considered this. "It might work if we can get her there safely." Clara looked between them. "What offer?" "William Garrison is a northern merchant who comes south for business," Martha explained. "He's departing for Philadelphia tomorrow on his private coach. As a favor to our network, he's agreed to transport someone, hidden in a compartment built into his luggage cart. It's designed to pass inspections along the way." Hope flickered in Clara's chest. "Where do I meet him?" "That's the problem," Samuel said. "His estate is 5 miles outside the city. You'd need to get there undetected, and with the increased patrols." A heavy knock at the door silenced them all. Samuel motioned for Clara to hide behind a curtain that separated the living area from a small bedroom. Heart pounding, she pressed herself against the wall, knife clutched in her trembling hand. Samuel opened the door to find a night patroller standing there, lantern held high. "Evening, Sexton," the patroller said. "Saw a light. Everything all right?" "Yes, sir," Samuel replied respectfully. "My aunt isn't feeling well. I was up making her some tea." The patroller peered past him into the cottage, where Martha had quickly taken a seat by the fire, shawl wrapped around her shoulders as if for warmth. "Evening, ma'am," the patroller said. "Sorry to disturb you." Martha nodded weakly. "God bless you for your concern, young man." The patroller seemed satisfied, but added, "Best be careful tonight. We're searching for a runaway, girl from the Devereux household, described as young, light-skinned. If you see anything suspicious, you'll report it?" "Of course, sir," Samuel assured him. "We're law-abiding folks here." After the patroller left, Clara emerged from hiding, face pale. "They know already how." "Someone must have checked your quarters early," Martha said grimly. "Perhaps another servant hoping for reward or favor." The situation had become even more desperate. Every minute Clara remained in New Orleans increased her risk of capture. The city would soon be swarming with patrollers and slave catchers, all looking for a girl matching her description. "We need to move now," Samuel decided. "I'll take her to Garrison's." "How?" Martha demanded. "They'll stop every colored person on the roads tonight." Samuel thought for a moment. "The funeral wagon," he said finally. "No one stops a funeral wagon, especially one carrying a victim of fever." The plan came together quickly. As sexton, Samuel had access to the chapel's small horse and wagon used for transporting the dead to burial. They would place Clara in a coffin, covered with a sheet as if a victim of the fevers that periodically swept through New Orleans. Samuel would drive the wagon as if making a late-night journey to a family unwilling to keep a fever victim in their home overnight. "It's dangerous," Martha warned Clara. "If they search the coffin, I'll take the risk," Clara said firmly. Freedom was worth any danger. Within the hour, Clara lay still in a plain wooden coffin in the back of the wagon, a sheet covering her body. Samuel had given her clear instructions: absolute stillness, shallow breathing, and silence no matter what happened. A small air hole had been drilled near her face, covered by the funeral cloth draped over the coffin. The journey through New Orleans was the longest of Clara's life. Every jolt of the wagon, every stop for patrols, sent fear coursing through her. Twice they were stopped by patrollers, but Samuel's explanation and the fear of fever kept them from examining the coffin too closely. "Yellow fever took her just this evening," she heard Samuel explain to one patrol. "Family wants her buried before dawn, away from their other children. You understand how it is with the fever, sir." The patroller's voice moved away from the wagon. "Go on, then. But keep to the main road." By the time they reached the outskirts of New Orleans, Clara's limbs were cramped and her lungs burned from the shallow breathing. But freedom lay ahead, not secured, not guaranteed, but possible in a way it had never been before. The Garrison estate was a modest property compared to the plantations Clara had known, but still substantial. Samuel drove the wagon to a side entrance where a stable hand waited, lantern held low. "You're the sexton?" the man asked quietly. Samuel nodded. "I have the package for Mr. Garrison." The stable hand led them to a carriage house where a traveling coach stood ready, luggage already loaded. A middle-aged white man with a serious expression emerged from the shadows. "Mr. Garrison." Samuel greeted him with a respectful nod. Garrison looked at the coffin. "Is this wise, using a funeral wagon?" "It got us past 3 patrols," Samuel replied. "No one wants to get close to fever." They quickly transferred Clara from the coffin to a hidden compartment beneath Garrison's luggage cart. The space was cramped, barely large enough for her to lie flat, but it was sturdily built with air holes concealed within the decorative woodwork. "Listen carefully," Garrison told Clara, as she settled into the hiding place. "The journey to Philadelphia will take approximately 2 weeks. You'll travel hidden during daylight and checkpoints. At night, when safe, I'll let you out to stretch and attend to necessities. Food and water will be limited, especially during difficult stretches of the journey." Clara nodded, committing his instructions to memory. "If we're discovered," he continued gravely, "I'll deny all knowledge of you, claim you must have hidden yourself without my awareness. It's not personal, it's to protect the network. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Clara replied. The harsh reality of her situation was clear. Even those helping her had to protect themselves first. "One last thing," Garrison said, handing her a small Bible. "Keep this with you. If we're separated, make your way to Philadelphia. Find the First African Baptist Church on Cherry Street. Ask for Deacon Wilson. Tell him William sent you." When the compartment was closed and darkness enveloped Clara, she lay in the confined space, heart pounding with both fear and hope. Freedom was not yet hers. There were countless dangers ahead, miles of hostile territory to cross, and no guarantee of safety even if she reached the north. But she had taken the first step on a journey that countless others had made before her, risking everything for the simple right to own themselves. As dawn broke over New Orleans, William Garrison's coach departed his estate, heading north. The journey passed checkpoints, river crossings, and town inspections. At each stop, Clara held her breath in her hiding place, praying for safety. Most nights, when Garrison deemed it secure enough, he would release her for brief periods to stretch her cramped limbs and breathe fresh air. The journey was grueling. Cold seeped into the compartment as they traveled northward into December. Food was scarce. Hard biscuits and dried meat passed to her during nighttime stops. Water was rationed carefully. Every unusual delay or voice outside the coach sent terror through her. 2 weeks stretched into 3 as weather and road conditions slowed their progress. They crossed into free territory, Ohio, but Garrison warned her that danger remained. The Fugitive Slave Act meant she could be legally captured and returned to Devereaux, even in free states. Only when they finally reached Philadelphia in late December did Clara begin to believe that freedom might truly be possible. Garrison brought her to the First African Baptist Church as promised, where Deacon Wilson welcomed her with solemn dignity. "You're not the first to come this way," he told her, "and you won't be the last. But each soul that reaches freedom reminds us why we continue this work." Clara was provided temporary lodging with a free black family who were active in abolitionist circles. They helped her adjust to life as a free woman, a strange and sometimes overwhelming experience after years of enslavement. "What will you do now?" her host, Mrs. Parker, asked her one evening. Clara thought of her mother at Briar Hollow, of the others left behind in chains across the South. "Learn," she said finally. "Learn everything I can, and then find ways to help others reach freedom." A noble purpose, Mrs. Parker approved, but a dangerous one. "Freedom is always dangerous," Clara replied, thinking of all she had risked and all who had helped her along the way. "But it's the only thing worth fighting for." As winter settled over Philadelphia, Clara began her new life, working as a domestic servant for an abolitionist family, attending classes at a school for free black children and adults, and carefully building an identity as Clara Freeman. Sometimes, late at night, she would take out William's book of folk tales and the small knife her mother had given her, tangible reminders of where she had come from and what she had overcome. She wrote letters, too, with her improving penmanship. Letters to Briar Hollow addressed to Esther, care of William Thornwood, hoping the young master might ensure they reached her mother. In them, she shared coded messages of her journey and new life, always signing them simply, "Your daughter," rather than her name, in case they fell into the wrong hands. Whether these letters ever reached their destination, Clara never knew. But the act of writing them connected her to her past while she built her future, a future defined not by ownership, but by possibility, not by chains, but by choices. In the spring of 1834, Clara joined a ladies' sewing circle that raised funds for the Underground Railroad. As she stitched alongside women of both races, united in the cause of abolition, she remembered her mother's words. "Our stories are like seeds. They look dead and dry, but plant them in your heart, and they grow into something that can't be killed." Her own story had only begun. A story of a young woman who had refused to accept the boundaries others had placed around her life, who had risked everything for freedom, who had discovered that the price of freedom was high, but its value was immeasurable. And as more fugitives arrived in Philadelphia with tales of courage and determination similar to her own, Clara understood a profound truth. A single seed of freedom, once planted, could grow to liberate not just one heart, but many. The chains of bondage might restrain the body, but they could never truly imprison the human spirit's longing to be free,